All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our June 2023 community call. Our topic for this month will be NSPM 33 updates and ORCID. So this is your usual staff of the ORCID US community. My name is Paolo Guhilde. I'm the ORCID US community specialist. And we also have my colleague Sheila Raymond, our program leader for Persistent Identifier communities. Sheila handles our ORCID US community as well as our DataCite US community. We also have our speakers for today. Shauna and Laurie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Lori, you go ahead.
Okay, hi, I'm Lori Schultz. I'm at the University of Arizona, where I am the Assistant Vice President for Research Intelligence. Nice to see you all here today. Thank you.
And hi, everybody. I'm Shauna Sadler with ORCID. I am the Engagement Manager for Outreach and Partnerships. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Laurie and Shauna, for joining us today. We're excited to hear more about what your thoughts are about ORCID, as well as NSPM 33. All right, so our agenda for today. So we're just gonna kind of do a quick overview, recap of NSPM 33, the activities within ORCID, as well as the ORCID US community. Shauna is gonna talk about recent developments related to federal policies, and that includes NSPM 33 and anything that kind of relates to that. And Laurie is gonna talk about the impact on researchers as well as organizations and what you can do to prepare for it. All right, so NSPM 33, or the National Security Presidential Memo-33, is really about a big part of this that relates to ORCID is persistent identifiers for individuals. So we're looking at policies regarding to that. So we really have sort of like individual researchers supported by or working on any federal research grant to be registered with a service that provides digital persistent identifiers for that individual. So the federal policies, they're calling it DPI, but we're probably much more familiar with it as persistent identifiers. So it's PIDs for individuals. A big part of this really relates to disclosure as well as security purposes of our researchers as well as organizations. And I'm sure Laurie and Shauna is going to talk more about that in a little bit. So the timeline of what's basically going on with NSPM 33 in the last few years is that in January 2021, the White House released NSPM 33. So basically, you can take a look at that memo, just kind of outlines what's going on. In January 2022, a year after that, we have the National Science and Technology Council released a guidance for implementing NSPM 33. In this guidance, it talks about how DPIs or persistent identifiers are needed within this context and what are sort of like the requirements or factors that would be beneficial to having this kind of service. And within that, they didn't really say that ORCID is the one that you should use, but however, ORCID does kind of, fulfill those kind of requirements within the context of the implementation. And then in August 2022, we also have a new memo that was released, which is the OSTP Public Access Memo. And this is really ensuring sort of like the free access to research within the federal government. So what's next about that? And that's kind of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today, and Shauna and Laurie is going to cover as well. Other developments also is that you have some federal agencies now are coming out with some of their own kind of guidelines as well as policies. They might not be implemented yet, but they are on their way. Sort of like some of them are drafts, some of them are just kind of proposals and all of those things. These are just some of the things that's available out there. We do have resources available for them on our one of our blogs and guides, which I will show you shortly. But one of the things that will probably relates to us quite heavily is those NSF kind of related policies. So you have the proposal on award policies and procedures guide that would be beneficial to take a look at, as well as the public access plan 2.0. And in this kind of proposals, it really kind of mentions more on the science CV format for bio sketches. So I think, and starting October 23rd, 2023, the science CV format will be required for bio sketches. And that's one thing that I think we need to be aware of. And just for the ORCID US community as well as ORCID, so these are just resources that we have currently. I mentioned that we have a blogs and guides that will be beneficial for you all. That first link, the NSPM 33 and ORCID, information for research organizations, is probably one of the best resources that you can take a look at because it kind of compiles all the information that I just talked about. Sheila and I have been following these developments, of course, getting information from Shauna and other areas of ORCID, and as well as what's going on out there. So we kind of compiled all of those information into this one document for you all to take a look at. So definitely a good reference to use. Lori, who's our guest today as well, actually did a presentation last year at the early stages of NSPM 33. So Lori talked about NSPM and ORCID last year. So we do have that recording. If you want to take a look at that recording, just email us at orcidus@lyrasis.org. We also had another session last year with University of Florida, and this one is about writing grant funding information in ORCID, and this relates to ORCID and NSPM as well. So there's a recording available for that, as well as a case study that you can read. And most recently, ORCID published a blog post titled ORCID Poised to support research institutions in era of public access and research security. Shauna is actually one of the authors of that blog post as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Shauna to take us further with NSPM 33 and other related policies.
Thanks, Paolo. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us here again today. Paolo, next slide, please. So just quickly, what I'm going to try and cover today is just what's new, what we can expect, and then how ORCID is going to respond, and what you can expect from ORCID, and of course, how we work with Paolo and Sheila for your community to best respond. Next slide, please. So some of the things that are new, actually, my first step is more at a global, more the international level. So first, there's a G7 working group on the specific topic of research security and integrity. There was a meeting in June. They called the communique. So there's a link to the communique if you want to read it when you get the slides. But really, it's just a genuine commitment from the G7. It's usually the G7, and then plus Australia and South Africa are usually invited as well. By this group to address research security and to have a common approach and to be in coordination with one another. And so they did establish a toolkit last year. That's not shared publicly, but we know it exists. But what we're seeing now is the development of formal organizations within each of the governments. So Britain has established a Department for Research Security. Canada proposed one last week for its community to consider. And in the US, and it was also encoded in the Chips and Science Act, which I will talk about next, but the point number 3 is this new department that's established in the NSF that is responsible for research security for the US. So it's a long name, Research Security and Integrity Information Sharing Analysis Organization. And so the acronym for that, I think they're working on RSI-SAO, I think, something like that. So we're going to have a new acronym for you all soon, but just know that the home for research security is the NSF in the US, and that all the universities that really the R1 universities or significant research universities will have a liaison to this group at the NSF. And the NSF, their role will be, just broadly speaking, to identify issues or concerns and make sure that the university is aware of it. It's usually going to be, I imagine, someone in research administration, like Lori Schultz, who will be their liaison and to communicate issues back and forth. So just to circle back to the second point, the Chips and Science Act, which is a huge, tremendous act. It's about 800 pages long, so it's not easy reading. But in that, they do talk about research security. They also require something they're calling quadrennial reporting, which is something new. I haven't heard that term before, but every 4 years, the White House, or specifically OSTP, has to report to Congress on research security and really about research and innovation progress. And so what we're starting to hear is that there's consideration of using ORCID data to help the White House come up with this data to then report to Congress. So hopefully all of you who've been working with ORCID and getting your researchers to sign up for ORCID, start populating their record, hopefully you all feel really empowered that this data will soon be most likely be, harvested by the White House and then shaped into a report that will go to Congress. So your work is really going to be helping the whole federal government at some point. So it's really good. So we're starting to see fantastic traction and uptake, and the quality and the quantity of data in ORCID records is going to become one of the topics soon. And so I quickly mentioned point 3, this new NSF group. There is an RFI on it. I'm sure all your research administrators have seen it and been part of these discussions. I don't know how much it's going to get to the library community, but it's something that's really good for you to be aware of, that you know it exists, and that the data that you're helping your researchers put into their records is important, and it is part of the bigger picture. All right, next slide, please, Paulo. So just going more specifically into the US government and some of the different departments. So I'm going to use my hands here. Paulo talked about 2 big initiatives. One is research security. The other one is public access. Some departments like NASA and NSF will do a policy for each one and, implement practices accordingly. Others, the NIH has said they're going to do one policy to address both. And it seems like that's okay, and each department is addressing this differently. So that's just something to keep an eye on. The NASA and the NSF responses are quite high level. It's just really good to be aware of them. I don't think it has strong impact yet, but that's really up for you to decide for yourselves. So I do try my best to get them to Sheila and Paulo so they can combine them into their documentation for this community. But the darndest thing, these departments don't tell us when they've released these policies. So I do my best to catch them in the wind and then share them with everybody. So I think we're making good progress. I think we're on top of it. So, but if you hear of one and you haven't heard us, please let us know, because that would be really helpful. 2, NIST has developed a new research data framework. It has just been released. It's out for RFI. So those of you who are in data management or have roles that overlap with your data management at your institutions, it's good to take a look at this. ORCID is clearly cited throughout the document, and it's really established as a best practice. So, so have a look at that. So when you get the slides, you've got the link to it. And I think it's a really powerful document that should really help everybody with their research data management practices. And then the one that's just come up, so we'll see how this shakes out, but the Department of Education may become part of this discussion, mostly due to research security, because universities receive gifts and they have to report those gifts. And the current process to report these gifts is cumbersome and difficult. And then the government complains that it's not timely. Yes, and of course, I knew Lori would have some things, but I've seen recently that some universities are saying we would really like to have a process similar to the NSF's current pending support form, which uses ORCID IDs. So I just thought I would raise this. And Lori, do you want to jump in real quick?
Sure. I think so. The Department of Education requirement is actually a longstanding requirement as a result of something called the Higher Ed Act in the US, which is totally separate from the research security conversation. But the reason it's sort of coming up in the same sentence is that other agencies are wanting to start to do the same thing with a requirement that we report foreign contracts and gifts through these various portals. As Shauna mentioned, the process is really cumbersome here. And by cumbersome, I mean The user experience and interface is terrible, and I'm okay to be quoted on that. It's bad. It's if you have more than a handful of things to report, it times out on you. You don't necessarily know what's been submitted and what hasn't, so you don't even really know if it's been done properly. So we're sort of encouraging, as the grantee community, that other agencies who want the same information, that can we get it to a place where we're asking for the same kind of information in the same kind of system, like the current pending support forms, where we can get this information all together in a more consistent way. There's a lot we don't know about what's going to happen next there. Thanks, Shauna.
No problem. So anyway, just thought I would bring it to everyone's attention just in case. So keep an eye out for it. All right, Paolo, next slide, please. So timelines, heaven help us, timelines. All of these policies that Paolo mentioned in the past, if you've been keeping track, they do have timelines in them. The White House, none of the agencies, none of them have met the timelines. They've all been blown past, and that's okay. But it's good for us to have a sense. It helps us and the wider community have a general idea of what to expect when. So what we're hearing from the agencies is generally around this timeline that PID policies are going to be expected to be published at the end of 2026. So that's a bit of a time, we've got some time. And that the agencies will be expected to implement them by 27. And of course, all of us will have much shorter timelines to implement and meet these expectations. So it's good for everyone to know about this, that's happening, and start preparing now. We probably won't see these timelines met, but it gives us a sense of how long we have to prepare for all of this. All right, next slide, please, Paolo. And so where we're at is that the White House is working with the different departments that fund research. And the goal that we heard in NSPM 33 and the follow-up guidelines is that the idea is to harmonize. So that way there's much more consistency in the policies and the expectations and the applications, so that everybody understands what is expected and how to do it. And so we'll hopefully have a harmonization of the whole workflow from beginning to end. And that will, in fact, help research security. So that way they can assess who's doing the right thing, how they're doing it, and there's greater confidence in what's going on. Because right now it's a bit of a mess. So just cleaning up the workflow and the data and the systems was a really good start. I've heard from Rebecca Kaiser, who's leading this new research security office for the NSF, that there's likely to be a new policy document from OSTP sometime between now and the end of the year that will have a better description of these harmonization practices and policies. So I'm just sharing this with everyone now, so keep an eye out for it. I haven't received it yet. I don't think Lori's received it yet, but it's something that we're expecting as the next document that will probably land on Paolo's timeline. Yeah. So.
And I would add there, what I expect to see before the end of the year is what they're calling the final product of the research security program standards. That is, I feel like the research security program standards are unlikely to change what we know today about the use of PIDs by the federal government. They go into some other areas though, like training and disclosure, where the forms do come into play. But as Shauna mentioned, the timelines on these things are long. We have a draft version of the harmonized forms, the biographical sketch, and the current pending support that still haven't been approved. So even at the point that the NSF is using Science EV in October, it'll still be their old version of the forms until the new harmonized forms are approved. So there are a lot of these things that have different timelines inside the larger picture.
All right, and next slide, please, Paolo. So ORCID, we're doing our best to try and keep track of what's happening, and of course to inform Sheila, Paolo, and the rest of the community. And as I mentioned before, please don't be shy. If you hear something, please send it through Paolo and Sheila to ORCID. We would really appreciate it. And as Paolo mentioned, we wrote a blog post not too long ago, so there's a link to it on the slide. And we also put together this infographic that we thought might be helpful to summarize, because it's quite a long blog post because there's a lot to cover. So this quick summary is about best practices, all the different stakeholders in the research ecosystem and what they can do in their ORCID adoption to prepare you best for these policies that are shaping up. So, so hopefully this is helpful. And Paolo, next slide. So something that we heard was Shawna, that's a big blog. And the bullet points are nice, but what would be helpful is an actual tool that we can bring to a meeting that I can put in front of everybody, especially the executives, so they understand, how many, there's 6 things we need to do as a university to meet these expectations. I'm just, we don't know what those expectations are. We still have to wait for some of these new policies, but we've started to draft this form and to help all of you. So once we have some more clarity from the agencies, we'll populate that section that says steps, and then we can share this with your community. And then this hopefully will be a tool to help you with your internal discussions at your universities or your organizations, so that you can say whether you've met this expectation, how it's been done. And then on the right, we're going to have some resources. Of course, Sheila and Paolo are developing fantastic resources, and we'll hopefully populate those to help you with your plans as well. So that's a tool that we have in development. And if you have feedback for us, we'd really appreciate it. And then Paolo, I think that's my last slide, isn't it? Fantastic. All right, I'll hand it over to Lori. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you, Shawna. If you could go to the next slide, please. I want to talk about a little bit about researcher burden in the context of NSPM 33, and frankly in the context of burden that existed before, and how research security kind of explodes what faculty and researchers need to do and understand in order to follow the rules, essentially, or what I have is listed as compliance activities. And some of those things are really unknown to us today, like what it's going to look like and what compliance means. We get a few nuggets of information here and there, but one of the things that is hardest right now is that none of this is final. We know what the U.S. federal grant making agencies care about in the broad picture, in the abstract, but the actual implementation and what it's going to look like, frankly, when there are reviews and audits, or even self-disclosures of things we think as institutions we may have done wrong, which is a common compliance activity when working with U.S. federal agencies, we don't really know what those things look like yet. And we probably won't know for a few years, even once the final rules are in place. And could I get the next slide, please? So the researcher burden in terms of grant workflows, I think that NSPM 33 research security and public access policies bring all of this burden that already existed into a much bigger relief and focus than it already had. So in the context of U.S. federal grant making agencies, while some of them have systems for submitting proposal applications and progress reports and the work that researchers do to get a grant, execute on the grant, and then tell the agency what they did with that money, these things that while there still may be systems, many of these things are electronic in name only. Like the construct of the forms they're submitting is sometimes still is paper, or is nothing fancier than a fillable PDF form, or the same thing translated into an HTML website. So some of the technology has not advanced to bring the data that's used in these forms over and over and over again to a place where it's integrated. And that's true across many US federal agencies. And there's no integration with sources of information. So unless you have a researcher with a very complete ORCID record and an institution that is writing to that record and keeping it updated, they're still pulling this information from many places. I talked briefly about the biographical sketch and current and pending support, as Paolo did in the beginning. All of the things that live inside those forms, if I'm talking about a 40-year career senior research investigator, that person probably has a Word document on their local hard drive with all this information that they update when they have to update. And that's literally as integrated as it gets for them. It's really common for all those things to live in one place. Their understanding of, their work history, their list of publications, anything that they list as outcomes, or, their data sets that go with their publications, they're typically not very integrated, and they plus one person in their lab might be the one who has access to that information. So part of the proposal and reporting requirements landscape in the US is that all of these checkpoints of submitting a proposal, submitting a progress report that require this information and updates to it throughout the life of a grant is still coming from disparate places. It's still creating a lot of burden in that someone, sometimes the investigator, sometimes not, is retyping that data into a system, into a form over and over and over again. And the grant funding itself is independent of publication workflows. So I spoke with an investigator this morning, literally, about updating his ORCID record for a question he had about submitting a manuscript, but he's not thinking about that when he submits a grant. And I think one of the things that we can do to prepare our researchers for it is to get them to think about those things at the same time. Publishers have done a great job of requiring ORCIDs in a lot of cases over a long period of time. So now people just do it. They don't necessarily think about it. But what researchers are not really doing is making the mental connection with their grant proposal process. They're thinking of it as two different things, and the workflows are very different and not necessarily compatible or overlapping in any way, depending on what discipline they're in. So part of this is it's difficult because we feel like we're talking about two different things, but we're talking about a very tightly connected Venn diagram, and we need to maybe highlight those overlaps a little bit better. I think that research security brings this into focus because now, when a proposal from a U.S. federal grant making agency is being reviewed by that agency, or there is a potential problem down the road after the grant is funded, what they're looking at is the accuracy and certification of that information that's coming from these 12 different places. Did Dr. So-and-so list all of their joint appointments in the proposal that were current as of that when that proposal was submitted? Did they talk about their collaborations? If I look back in the data of their publications, are there acknowledgements about what grant funded that work and what conflicts of interest they may have had to disclose at that time? Or do these things all line up? And I think that, research security is taking that bigger picture view of the data and really explaining how the grant workflow needs to change so that we are better at capturing it. And to the extent we can, using things like ORCID to reduce that burden so that the information is coming from one place and not my old Word document from a version of Word that I no longer have that hasn't been updated and who knows how long, and nobody knows how to recreate that wheel, because that is what's happening. Can I get the next slide, please? And then I mentioned before sort of the unknown about compliance. So, we've lived with data management and sharing policies from the NIH in particular for a number of years now, and for some federal agencies for the past 10 years. What we have never seen really at US universities is what happens when something goes wrong. At a certain point, like someone might get an email and saying, oh, you didn't put that article in PubMed, they fix it, the end. So, they fix that quick error and it's not really a problem. But we haven't seen, are there systemic issues with people not sharing publications and data? We haven't seen what that might look like. And with the new NIH policies that just went into effect this past January, we still don't know what it's going to look like if someone says you're not following the rule here, and how that I want to say violation in air quotes because that's a scarier word than it probably will be. What that looks like when someone does it and the NIH feels like we've done something wrong, we don't know what the outcomes will be there, what the consequences of breaking that rule are. And then, this sort of explodes a little bit further with the Nelson memo that both Paolo and Shauna referenced. This is a game changer for U.S. universities, and I think more than research security will be the thing that gets more investigators to use ORCIDs and keep their profiles up to date. Because now we're talking about no more embargo. We're talking about the data be available upon publication, and ensuring that they're using the PIDs in that workflow, like ORCIDs and DOIs, is going to be how they prove they've done it. I think a lot of investigators are aware of that and understand how that's going to work. But, you know, like we're 2 years down the road from the agencies having to implement the public access policy, and there are 26 of them. You know, as Shauna mentioned, they're trying to harmonize, but there are still 26 of them. So there's a potential for many rules that overlap and maybe even conflict. And some of that, you know, as I've been in research administration for a long time, and sometimes the idea that they can't just do the same thing, do one thing the same way, is extremely frustrating to all of us. But that isn't always their fault. The differences they have a great deal to do with their budget appropriation and the rules that are imposed upon them by having a budget from Congress. So some of those differences are things they just can't work out of the system without legislative changes. And for some of them, those appropriations and the legislative language are the reason they exist. So some of those things are just not going to change, and we have to live with it, as frustrating as it is. And I think that, you know, for another part on the burden is, okay, if I am a researcher and I am publishing and I have data that goes along with my publications and I'm doing the right thing and depositing my data in a repository, I might be depositing it in my institutional repository because we require it. I might be depositing it to my sponsor's repository because they require it. And I also might be depositing it to a discipline-specific repository because it is the norm in my field. And not doing that is just sort of like, it's not a rule, but I'm not going to not do it because everyone else in my field does it. So we're still talking about the potential of them having to deposit data and other information 3 or 4 times. And so like we sharing data and publications is very important, but can we figure out a way to do this better so that they don't have to do it 3 or 4 times? Because I think that is a very legitimate example of how this is going to work. And then the other part of it is like, how do we now work with big publishers? We are already seeing that some of them are moving to stop automatic deposits in things like PubMed, unless you are paying for an OA APC. And they will, you know, the ones that are doing that now, they won't be the only ones. like I think we can all sort of anticipate that that's what it looks like for our researchers. It's like, I do this myself, or I pay a lot of money for someone to do it for me. And what does this look like between, you know, June 2023 and December 2025, when the first public access policies have to be implemented by these federal agencies? And we just don't know. We don't know what it's going to look like. We know that there are a great deal of impacts to our researchers and our organizations with these changes around burden, around having the systems in place that help with that burden and maybe alleviate some of that burden. But I would argue we are not there yet. And can I get the next slide, please? And that sort of, you know, brings us to the impacts on our organizations. It's, you know, we have to understand what's happened to date and what's coming. We have to figure out our own silos, which I think research security in particular has uncovered that universities, which is the largest part of the grantee community for US federal agencies, is that we're siloed, and we're not always even siloed in the same ways. And that has a lot to do with resources, that our ability to work together and collaborate on things that are not the highest priority that's sitting on my desk today can be really difficult if we're understaffed, or, you know, we're going through a lot of staff turnover and other things that are happening as a result of the pandemic and people's lives moving around. Like we're still in a lot of flux that we have not recovered from. Can I get the next slide, please? So, you know, as Paolo mentioned and Shauna mentioned, since 2021, we've seen multiple things happen with NSPM 33. So we saw the memo, we saw the first draft guidance, we've seen the draft research security program standards, and have had the ability to comment on all of those things, but nothing is final yet. Like we don't know, like, as I mentioned before, we do know what they care about in the abstract. How we implement the practices of what they care about is something we don't know yet. And so part of it is balancing what we do now, how we communicate it to faculty, and how we engage our own campus stakeholders in understanding what's coming it's really a balancing act, because I can raise the alarm on research security and convene a group of people to talk about it, and then we'll have nothing to do for 3 or 4 months. So keeping the momentum is very difficult for all of us when while a lot of stuff is happening, not a lot of stuff is changing at any one time, and there's no clear set of actions for some parts of this life cycle of research security. There isn't a clear guidance on what they should do now. In order to make the best use of their resources, to make the best use of their staff, to request budget if they have to request budget. It's actually really difficult. So what a lot of us are still doing is figuring out what we can do now without wasting the precious resources, and what we should do now. And a lot of that is just, outreach and training about what we know, not necessarily on a required front for training, but like talking to people that we know will be impacted, so that in 6 months to a year, they may not remember everything I said, but they remember, oh, Lori's the one that talks about research security, and they remember to call me or email me. Sometimes just like setting them up for that, back burner memory is what we can do now, without wasting a lot of time, wasting a lot of our communication cycles, where they're just going to stop listening to me. Because, I think that at a big university with a lot of activity, I have to be very careful, and my senior leadership has to be careful about how often and when they communicate, because we need them to listen. And so we also are trying to evaluate impacts across multiple dimensions here. There is research security, like who and when our faculty are collaborating with outside the US, and what those collaborations mean, how they impact the proposal life cycle, how they impact the publication life cycle. But then there are other pieces that impact the work of our researchers that are embedded in all of that: where they're traveling, whether or not they're getting the appropriate safety and security briefings about where they're traveling, including bringing devices, and how their data is at risk depending on where they're traveling and what protections they might have in place. So some of those things we already do know, and we can provide advice now, but we're anticipating what the requirements will look like later on, where documentation of our giving that advice or that training is probably going to be required. Can I get the next slide, please? I talked a little bit about the silos and gaps, and this is just a list of the different units at my own campus that are involved in these conversations around research security, public access, and ORCID implementation. And for many of these, if I took, research security, ORCID implementation, public access, and put it all together, many of these folks are in all 3 conversations. So depending on where you are, this list may even be longer. Aside from the research office and the libraries, your faculty affairs folks might be involved. When we talk about like the foreign travel piece and how research security impacts collaborations that physically take people outside the US, we're then talking about our travel systems, how travel gets paid, and how those things work. We're also talking about IT units in my example of, security of their data as they travel, because at the end of the day, research security is about protecting someone's work. And so they have to think about those things when they're traveling. And most of us don't. Most of us don't think about that Wi-Fi that our phone connects to when we're traveling somewhere. We also have to think about other kinds of compliance that might be happening in the life of a grant or their research, like conflicts of interest and commitment, or other regulatory issues like human subjects or the kinds of work they do. And we have to get faculty governance involved. Our faculty senate needs to be aware of how this impacts faculty, and frankly, what it looks like when people have done or are perceived to have done the wrong thing. And there are many examples in the news of what that's looked like in the past couple of years. And this really affects everyone. It affects everyone in research that's funded by the US federal government, all the way from my grad students through postdocs, through all of my faculty to the most senior level. And them understanding that fundamental shift in their day-to-day activities for the grant workflows, and how that is read by federal agencies once they get to the point where they're publishing the results of that work, is really important for them to understand that it's really everyone. Can I get the next slide, please? Okay. So, a lot of things that all of us have really faced is, in the conversations here with lyricists and in the regular coffee calls we have, I hear the same thing from a lot of you, which is we had a great plan for ORCID adoption, and then the pandemic happened, because our plans were in person. Our plans were to be at faculty events and grad college events and those kinds of things where we could really talk to somebody about having an ORCID. And a lot of us are still recovering from that. I mean, 3 years feels like a long time, but so much has changed in between, including our resources and staffing, that we're really having to start all over on what that looks like. And that takes into account that if you're at a university in particular, your budget process, you may need to start anticipating for new resources 1 or 2 years out from your actual budget request. And that is not easy to do. Otherwise, you are trying to figure out how to do things with no additional funding, or piecing together funding from multiple places before you can enter the next budget cycle. And then trying to integrate the silos from my previous slide. Your mileage may vary on your campus, but sometimes you're going to talk to someone and say, well, if that's not an emergency on my desk right now, I can't even deal with it. And that might be a totally accurate reflection of their workload. And so it can be really difficult to build the relationships and make the time to build those relationships to do it. And sort of, last but not least here is that, as I mentioned before, choosing the timing of communications and repeating the vision here to an audience that has heard from us about many different kinds of things, and figuring out how to choose the timing and share the message in multiple ways, to where they don't necessarily memorize every word you say, but they remember you're the one that's talking about that thing, so that when they finally get the message or have the mental space to handle it, they remember to talk to you. They remember to send you the email so that you can have that conversation again. And that's, it's not easy. Like we try to figure out ways to get the message out in very low touch ways, our email signatures, our websites that we know they visit often, plus the actual harder touch emails that go out from our central communications. Like a lot of those things, we just have to come up with a marketing strategy for ourselves here, because it's not easy to get the message heard by all the people who need to hear it. And my next slide, please. And I think, for a lot of us, in trying to figure out what we could and should do now, it is figuring out who needs to be involved. And whether you have targeted working groups for a defined set of work that maybe won't continue for a long time, or a kind of steering group for things that will continue and need governance. Like I would separate that out like I do at my own campus. We have a working group that is set up and made up of the research office, our libraries, and different colleges and faculty to evaluate what we think are the long-term impacts of the Nelson Memo. Just that piece. We don't expect that work to continue forever, but the steering groups for research security probably will continue in some way forever. Like we need governance there as the final rules come out, and these moving bits, they don't all report to the research office. So that governance has to come from multiple places on campus. And so a lot of the things we're working on that we can work on today is increasing ORCID adoption, ensuring that our faculty and the staff that support them understand how to use Science EV and what's changing there, and any training requirements that have come up with foreign influence research security and the CHIPS and Science Act. The acronym here is called Responsible and Ethical Conduct of Research. A lot of those things bring the PID universe in as part of the training piece and explain how that data is being used. But those trainings are still being evolved. So I think that what training might happen on your campus will look really different a year from now than it does today. And then, sort of looking to the future, building the relationships, keeping an eye on what's going on, who's releasing what, and how we need to react to it. And then, what I'm fond of saying is that we have to hurry up and wait. So it feels urgent, but again, I could convene a group and still not have something to tell them for 3 or 4 months. So a lot of it is like crafting the message, timing it, having people understand that you're out there to talk about this, but knowing that there isn't a lot to always update them on every month or every 2 months. So we're just sort of keeping an eye on things, treating them with the urgency it requires, but also knowing that implementation for a lot of these final rules is still more than a year away. So it can be hard to set up the right timing. And with that, I mean, I'm done with my slides and happy to take questions from the panel or the rest of you.
Thank you so much, Laurie and Shauna. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, please enter them in the chat, or you can also unmute and ask questions to Laurie and Shauna. I'm actually going to bring it back to the last slide, so that way, let's see if I could actually get back to the last slide. There you go. That's a good way to kind of just to remind us on what you can do to prepare for upcoming changes. So that's, so I'm just going to leave that on there for a little bit while we wait if you have any questions. Any questions from our attendees? Okay, so I guess I'm kind of curious about, if we talk about ORCID adaptation, Lori and Shauna, what kind of ORCID adaptation are we thinking of? Are we thinking about signing up for ORCID, having an ORCID ID? Are we looking at, say, writing to ORCID, for example? What are some examples that would you like to share about that?
For us, it's a little bit of both. It is getting it out there, getting people to set their ORCID up and share it with the U of A, because we are a member organization. And so it's that, and then us, for us, and Sean is a part of this conversation as well. It's talking about writing to records and what is going to be the biggest bang for us in terms of research security. And we are working with our ERA vendor on a possible solution there. We use a system that captures all of our awards, and it would be really great to write our awards to ORCID, because we know who those folks are. And we have the 26 individual federal agencies know what grants they issued, but if all of them issued a grant to me, I know all of it. So I'm a better source than the individual agencies for the complete record for my faculty members. And so we're looking at how that might work for us with our current ERA vendor, who is also working with ORCID to figure out how that's going to work for them.
And I think I used to work in universities before I crossed the floor to ORCID, and so I can imagine if I were in your shoes, just given the policy from the White House that they're pretty clear, that ORCID is the identifier for researchers. I think something for universities to consider is, some of the policies that you have on campus. Do you encourage or require an ORCID ID for each of your researchers? And then how do you capture, so the ORCID ID of each of your researchers? I think that in itself is a great first step. There's different systems out there. It's essentially like a researcher inventory system. And, a huge question for a lot of universities, how do you define a researcher? Who do you include in that list? And that's a bit of a conversation. And if you don't have that answer, then you might want to start that conversation now, because eventually at some point, you might want to have a system where that lists all your researchers, however you define them, their ORCID IDs, and then to be able to coordinate the data that you have to know about each of these researchers and be able to report. So I think just even that is a huge first step, is defining a researcher, and if you're going to require or recommend an ORCID ID for each of them. I just saw in the chat a question about Science CV and ORCID prepping. And I think to respond to that, what you could probably do from your side right now is that there's Science CV today, and then knowing Science CV will be changing soon, possibly by the end of the year next year, and what those fields will be are to be determined. I was just looking for some slides for that exact data, but so the NSF has a stronger ORCID adoption today of the BioSketch adopters. The agencies adopting the BioSketch and Science CV, we are expecting to increase. So I think that's, the ORCID adoption is good. Works, if you can do anything to help your researchers get works into their ORCID record, I know they would appreciate it. We hear a lot about that. And then I think employment data, because some things, I host a funders interest group from funders around the world, and they say getting the accurate data from researchers is actually one of the hardest bits. Then their staff have to spend a lot of time correcting the data, because researchers don't always get it right. And so if you could help them by writing their accurate employment data to their ORCID record, which that data will then be recycled into the forms for funding applications, and then of course manuscripts as well, that'll be a tremendous help to everybody. And so I think that's something that's under this group's purview as well. So I think, Lori, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that, because I was looking through the participant list, and I want to call out Ellen Dubinsky, who's our scholarly communications librarian, who does a great session on Science EV for our faculty, and we'll continue doing things like that. The hard part is, you're right, NSF is the one who is doing this first, and they will start requiring the forms be created out of Science EV in October. So part of it is like, what's the balance of getting them to understand how to use it, but don't bother me right now because it's June, and I'll do this when I have to do this. And so part of that is like, we need you to devote some time to learn, so that on October 23rd, you're not freaking out and missing a deadline because you couldn't get it to work properly. So part of it is that is the sessions that we throw, and then our sponsor projects office giving a lot of one-on-one help to faculty and the departmental research administrators that support them in creating Science EV is what we're doing now. Yeah.
Thank you, Laurie and Shauna. I also just kind of want to add that from the ORCID US community standpoint, we are following what's going on with Science CV and see if there are any updates. Of course, we will let our members know of any of those updates. We also have our workshop for researchers that we basically present at least 4 times a year. And one of those workshop for researchers is really focusing about creating an ORCID ID, populating your ORCID record, and maintaining your ORCID record. And that's a really great resource for your researchers to be able to kind of basically, maintain. A big part of it is maintaining the ORCID record, right? And that's a big part of that, is making sure that our researchers know what's going on. So we do have one upcoming, maybe in the I would say August, that we will have a workshop for researchers. We'll definitely advertise that and promote it to everyone. Great. So it looks like there are other questions there as well in the chat. I don't know, between Lori and Shauna, is there a way to balance faculty with multiple institutional associations? So we're looking at, say, like say a visiting faculty or a joint appointment, for example, whose institutions both want push and pull. I'm not quite sure exactly if Jennifer, if you want to explain or expand a little bit on your question, feel free to do so. All right. It looks like a prior institution cannot balance how much of a project to claim as your own. So, for example, controlling receiving third of a faculty's research with 2 other current co-appointments. So is it up to researcher burden as opposed to removing the capitalism and ego, which I understand is how we get faculty affairs provosts to be interested. Lori, do you have any thoughts on that?
This is a really hard one, because aside from having, sharing with multiple organizations to write records to ORCID, when a person has joint appointments or is moving around, like transferring from one institution to the other and taking their grants with them, it is definitely a fundamental problem to figure out. Say, yeah, that grant was at the U of A and then it moved to Princeton, but we both still want to claim it as something in the past and something that's happening right now. And how do we do that? I don't know that we've actually solved that problem. And I don't know if Shauna, you wanted to weigh in on the multiple sharing of institutions.
So I think for ORCID, how about if I address the employment section of an ORCID record? That's probably the easiest. So I think first and foremost, the ORCID record is owned by the researcher. And the researcher can approve organizations like universities to write data to their ORCID record. And so when, let's say, University of Arizona writes the employment record, their employment data to their researcher's record, it can have a start and end date with all the titles. And then that person moves to Princeton. That person approves Princeton to write their new employment data. That will be a new line item on their ORCID record with that new data from Princeton, with the title and the start and end dates of their employment. So when they're juggling multiple, and the ORCID record can accommodate multiple times, like start and end dates, because of course there's researchers at multiple institutions simultaneously. It's a complicated environment, but the ORCID record can accommodate that. It will just have a single line item for each institution. And it's ideal when the institution writes that data. It's a trusted information that way, and it can be verified. And again, just looking to the funders, what they're saying is that they really appreciate when the universities write this information. It's something for a researcher to claim, because the researcher can write data to their ORCID records. So they can say, I work for Harvard. But it's another thing for the Harvard to write that information to the researcher's record. And I know funders really appreciate it. Helps them understand the professionalism of this person that's applying for a lot of money. It gives them a better idea. So if your university can write the employment data, it really helps your university get more research funding. And so I think that's a really big part of something that you all can do to help your research institution overall. But just so you know, we can accommodate multiple line items. Oh, I see the chat. There's lots of messages. I'm having a hard time responding and reading. Is there another question that you think we should respond to?
Let's take a look. Do we have any other questions from our attendees? I think we have a question about the ERA systems. I'm not sure if we could answer this at this time, but how is the uptake with ERA systems for ORCID? I don't know, Shauna, do you have a take on that? Or we could take a look at it and answer it later as well.
Actually, that's a great question. And I've got two responses to that. So one, the uptake is really good. I think they are the ERA. So ERA, for everybody, Electronic Research Administration System. So that's a system that's really like Lori's system. So your research administrators, so they can keep track and inventory of what's happening on campus. So those vendors have certainly heard, the federal government, the agencies, the White House talk about this. I was at the NCURA, which is like one of the big research administrative meetings last year, and most of the vendors approached me and they said, we need to adopt ORCID. How do we do that? And so with lots of conversations have started, and we've got lots of momentum happening, which is great. We haven't officially launched any of them yet, but it's in progress, I promise. And so we'll definitely make sure that we communicate to Sheila and Paolo when those systems are connected to ORCID and start reading and writing data to ORCID records. And then if anybody's at NCURA meeting this August, there'll be a group of us from ORCID there again. And so please come and say hi. And if you have any questions for us or want to schedule coffee, just reach out. It'd be nice to talk to you in person. Lori, any?
No, I think that's it. I think that it's encouraging to those of us who are customers of these products that they're thinking about it in the way that we are. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Lori and Shauna. So we are at the top of the hour. So I just want to say thank you to Lori and Shauna for being here today and giving us all of your insights as well as your expertise in this area. We really appreciate it. If anyone have any other questions, feel free to email it to us at orcidus@lyrasis.org. We're more than happy to answer or talk to you or have a conversation with you via Zoom. That's a big part of what we do here with Sheila and me. So feel free to email us. And again, we will share our agenda and notes. So if you come in with some questions now, we will add those questions in our documents as well, and we will answer them there. All right. So again, thank you, Lori. Thank you, Shauna. And thank you, everyone, for attending our session.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.